There you go. So we have Gerry Cutting here today, former president of the Township Association and educator. We're pleased to have him. We're going to begin with some background questions for Gerry for context, as we do with each interviewee. So Gerry, I'm going to start by asking, where were your parents born?
Well, my dad was born in Quaticook, Quebec, which is a part of the townships. And my mom was born in a small town, Saint-Anna, which is on the St. Lawrence River. And that's so that you probably already can gather that I come from slightly or a whole lot of a mixed background with the French, English, and was a great way to grow up.
And where were you born?
I was born actually in Sherbrooke. And that's because Quaticook didn't have a hospital where I could be born. So it was on a stormy, snowy night that my dad drove my mom and the family doctor to Hotel Dieu in Sherbrooke, where I was born later, 6 o'clock in the morning on the 22nd of December. So I was almost a Christmas present.
And where did you receive your education, your elementary, your secondary, and post-secondary?
Well, I attended Quaticook High School, which once upon a time was the Quaticook Academy. That's where my granddad, my father, and I received our primary and secondary education. And from there, I went on to study psychology and philosophy at the University of Prince Edward Island. And I received a fellowship to West Georgia University, where I studied clinical psychology. And then I took another degree in counseling psychology from McGill. So I've spent a great deal of time both in the seat as a student, and then went into teaching from that point on.
Okay. Now, I think you've already answered this question, but for the record, I'm going to ask it anyway. What is or was your occupation or occupations?
Well, I started off as a clinical psychologist who was also teaching. So I was teaching and had a small private practice. And then I did that for 5 years. And then I became director of student services at Champlain College, Lennoxville. That's where I started my teaching career in 1972. And I did that for 5 years. And then I became the campus director at the Lennoxville campus for the next 15 years. And then I finished off my career as director general of Champlain Regional College, the 3 campuses, and I retired from that job in 2008. So I've been, if you want to know what I do now as a retiree, I spend an awful lot of time doing volunteer work. I'm not a professional volunteer person, but I'm pretty darn close. Keeps me active, keeps me on the ball, and then I get to do a lot of things that I really enjoy to do with some great people.
Wonderful. And where do you live now?
I now can say, and I'm very proud of this, I live in the home that was built for my grandparents in 1919. I've renovated just about everything in the house and added on and done a lot to improve and just bring things up to date. But it's something that's very dear to me because I used to come and help out my grandparents every summer on the farm. And this is the last 100 acres that was originally part of the family farm. So I have, spent many years here, and I still enjoy being here. Get to do a lot of gardening, get to go and cut firewood, get to, go for long walks in the woods. And I have 2 sons, both of them are very much attached to the place too, except that the oldest one he's been in Newfoundland for the last 23 years, and the younger one, he's in Lennoxville. But it's something that we have a heritage here. As an 8th generation townshipper, we feel proud to be here. It's our home.
Very good. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction and your background, Gerry. Now we're going to move on to kind of what I call the meat of the matter, of what we're trying to get people to express here about living in Quebec. So I'm going to start off with seemingly a very simple question. What is the best thing in your experience about living in Quebec?
Well, I'm going to have to disappoint you. I can't say there is one thing. I think what it comes down to is that wherever you live, you've got to have a mix of different elements. One of them that I find is very, very interesting is that it's a continuation of what I grew up with. It is very much a society that is in many ways different from what you'll find any place else in North America because of the French. And that cultural, linguistic quality there that is very, very interesting. And the other part of it is that being here in the townships was essentially a great wilderness back in the late 1700s when people first started to come here. And it made no difference if you were English, if you were French, if you were a Scot, a Welsh, or an Irish person. We confronted exactly the same thing, survival. We cleared the forest. If someone was sick, couldn't go and do the chores, you didn't ask them what language they spoke. You just went over and lent a hand. And I think one of the absolute necessary factors to feel good about what the place you're in, it is the people. And I think here in the townships, we have, to a great extent, maintained that kind of an attitude, is that it is really much more important to know what your values are, to know how you behave in relationship to other people, than it is to hang a label on a person. So that really is two big things, not just one. And they are big things, I think, for me anyway.
Now, the next question, I will admit, if somebody was asking me this question, I would have difficulty with it. But I'm going to ask it anyway. Describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
That is a difficult one because it's changed over time. And my relationship to Quebec would be one where I am surprisingly perhaps going to answer it this way. I'm comfortable.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, that leads us to the next question. Where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
I feel most comfortable when I am with people who share the same values. I found that here in the townships. I've found that walking down the street and bumping into people in Montreal. I found that in the Gaspé. I found that in the Gatineau. And what it comes down to is that I think there is a certain quality to being perhaps a Quebecer that has forced everybody who is more of my age than perhaps a younger age to realize that we will survive if we learn and do live together. And that in terms of our working environments, that there is, I think, a great deal to be said is that can you work with people And if you can work with people, then you start to socialize with people. And once you start to socialize with people, you become friends. And then once you become friends, you can have some very serious differences. But what it comes down to is that at the end of the day, we go home friends. And I think I've been able to experience that in so many places in this province. Of course, an awful lot more in the townships because that's where I grew up. I've worked here. I am very active in a number of different organizations here. And so, if you really press me, where do I feel that these values are most in evidence? And I'll have to say, it's home, chez nous. Townships.
Very good. Now, the next question is a two-part question, and a lot of people have had difficulty with the second part because of the word official definition of Quebec. And they ask me, well, what official according to who? And my answer to that, and what we strive for in formulating these questions, was the official definition as you perceive it from the various institutions, including the government, and your experience has been over the years. And that, of course, has changed as well. So I'm going to ask the full question and let you answer in any way you see fit. So how would you define a Quebecois or Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
I'm going to probably have to take a little bit more time to answer that because my definition of Quebecer has changed radically in regard to legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had asked me what a Quebecer is, even after Bill 101, I would say a Quebecer who is English speaking. And I, even though I'm quite bilingual, I identify more with the English background because very simply it's this. My mom was orphaned with her 4 sisters and brother during the Great Depression. My grandfather had a small furniture store in Saint Denis. Nobody was buying furniture. He lost everything. He lost his business, he lost his home, he lost his kids, he lost his wife. And the kids ended up in an orphanage. So that I did not have that same kind of experience with grandparents on my maternal side of the family as I did with my paternal side. So I have a very strong connection to the English community. And in that sense, it used to be that to be a Quebecer, all you had to do is you felt that this was your home and that you made friends, and you had a sense that the definition of being Quebecer was more in keeping with where you lived, with its distinct culture and its distinct linguistic characteristics. That has changed, and I think it's changed because of social engineering, to the point where when you say, I am Quebecois, what you are saying then, or have been led to believe that you should be saying, has been very carefully thought out. And it is to make you feel as if you have more allegiance to a definition of Quebecois that is predominantly a nationalistic orientation to a Quebec that is not just a definition of a territory with very specific and very different linguistic and cultural characteristics. It is something that should in fact be much more separate from Canada. And in that sense, I think right now, when I am asked, are you Quebecois? I say, je suis Canadien. Because what I want to affirm is that I want to affirm something that is more of the tradition I grew up with. And when I was growing up, to be Canadien meant that you were French speaking and that you identified yourself as being different, as having something that was valuable, that made you a part of North America with a very distinct characteristic. Well, the term Québécois for me now elicits another reaction. It is one in which, in its present form, is defined in Bill 96 as a separate Quebec nation in which there is only one official language. And that is so different from recognizing that in many ways, I take perhaps might be a commercial model. If 85% of all of the customers that walk in your door to buy what you have in your store are French speaking, you will have signage in French, of course. You will make sure that your salespeople can deal in French because you want to sell things because that will lead to your prosperity. So it's just good common sense to recognize the French fact, and that in terms of that will be a part of it. But when legislation says to you as an individual, there's part of your identity. It may be a big part of your identity. It may be a lesser part, depending on the individual. But take me, I think a big part of my identity is the identification that I am an English-speaking Quebecer who is a very proud Canadian. And that if then I must confront what now is an obstacle to me being able to realize in a more public sense that my identity is as valuable to me as a French-speaking Quebecer values their French identity. And I feel profoundly that we can be very proud Quebecers and Canadians. And I don't accept, and I have become very active in speaking out against and working with other people to challenge this legislated identity that is one of total assimilation. And if I were in fact someone who's First Nation, I would feel even worse about my situation. So I may have been long-winded in this one, but it's very important, I think, to each and every one of us who must confront that. And we can't escape the confrontation. There is a legislation out there that says that if you're an English speaker, you have one identity. That's to be a Quebecer, and you cannot be the concept of an English-speaking Québécois has been one that I think has been slowly moved from acceptability. You're part of this province, you're a part of this country. You can even say, okay, there is a nationalistic feeling proud about being French. That's good, that's fine. But I feel the same way about the English identity and culture too.
Well, you've answered that question very well. And it leads me to the next one, which I think you probably have answered, but for the sake of ensuring that we have covered all our bases here, I'm going to ask the next question anyway, at the risk of repetition. Has your sense of identity as a Quebecer or Québécois changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
Yes, it has. And it has because I have had to confront, not necessarily that I have been thinking differently, because I have always valued my mom's heritage, her language, what she brought to the family. I've always valued what my dad and his language, his background have brought to the family. And I felt that as I have grown older, there have been differences that have emerged. And I think we can never forget at one time, there were terrorists operating in Quebec whose intention was to create a separate nation. And they subscribed to fundamental, I think, Marxist teachings that they were quite prepared to use violence to achieve their ends. We had that here. That was the first experience that I had of, this isn't just a friendly discussion, even though it can get pretty heated around the dinner table. There were people who were ready to kill other people, and they did, in order to achieve their ends. And at that point, I felt one cannot just stand by and let things happen. You have to describe yourself in a way that either you are someone who feels you're the target of or a potential target of this violence just because you happen to be an English person. And at that point, it became very much a real issue to me, and that I had never been threatened before because I was different. And again, I began to think in terms of, wow, now I understand a whole lot more about what some of my Black friends, and I even have developed some Indigenous friends too, how they must feel. It doesn't feel good. And so I had to then, in a certain sense, make a decision. A whole lot of people just picked up and left because they didn't want to be stuck in what was looking like the development of another Northern Ireland situation. Well, it didn't happen. But we have to consider that there are people who have moderated their approach to achieving some of those same ends. And they're doing it now in much more of a pas d'étape, by step by step. And one of the first things that I came to a conclusion on Bill 96, this is going to lead to sovereignty association without a referendum. Yes, Mr. Legault, you will not have a referendum. You will simply pass bills, and at a certain point, we will in fact be a sovereign nation. And it's one in which I have felt that, oh, well, guess what? I'm not an easy guy to move. These are my roots, and they go very deep, and I feel very connected to a Quebec that can be everything that I think both English speakers and French speakers and newcomers can feel identified with. But it should be based on the concept that everybody has a place at the table. And that one of the things that we can do together is that we can, in fact, look at how we can celebrate what is a Quebec of diversity. And it has many treasures that we need to put forward. And we have to get around, I think, to that realization. One of the things that I think English speakers want to have, they want to have an education that when they graduate from high school, they're fluent in French and that they don't have to even ask this question. And at the same time, I think what we want to see is that French-speaking students who graduate from a French school should be bilingual enough so that they feel as if they don't need to separate from the rest of North America in order to enjoy a full, complete life lived in French for the most part. I think we could do it. The question is, do we have enough people who want to do it?
Now, thank you for that, Gerry. Again, at the risk of you repeating yourself, and you come at things from often answer the same question, but you come at it from a different, which I as an interviewer find very interesting. So I'm going to simply ask you the next question. And I know you've alluded to this in some of your other responses, and that's fine, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec today, in your experience?
In my most recent experience, the most difficult part is from time to time encountering individuals or encountering, as I did with Bill 96, a rejection of me as a person, me as an English-speaking person who can function very well in a French milieu. I have many French friends. I feel very comfortable in Quebec. I feel I can, I'm a member of the Chiers de l'Estrie hospital board. It's all in French. I have no problems with that, because what we're working for is to make sure that everybody has the best possible health care. So let's not hang labels on each other. Let's hang labels and targets on what is the work that needs to be done. And when I encounter situations where that doesn't count, it's that you pointing the finger at me represents something that is objectionable just because of who I am and what I am and my background. This is the most difficult part. I encounter that from time to time. And for those people who encounter me with that, they had best be prepared, because I don't put up with it. I'm willing to debate anyone, anytime, in French or English, the merits of being what I think makes one a true Quebecer Canadian.
Very good. Thank you, Gerry, for that. To get a little more, drill down a little bit more specifically, the next question is, in recent years, Quebec's Francophone majority has identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats as they perceive them. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
Well, I would have to say the first part of that is one that is it's perhaps difficult for me to answer because I feel comfortable. But if I were a unilingual Francophone and I was thinking in terms of the kind of messaging that has been received, I think we have to talk about the messaging that causes one to accept or reject certain elements of what's going on here. So let me answer that question this way. And I hope I get down to really getting at what you want to expose here. I think what we have had in the recent years is a lot of reference to stats. I taught statistics at one point, and I can tell you, you can use statistics to create your messaging. It doesn't necessarily always mean your message is correct. It's just the way you package it. And I think there has been a steady diet fed to the Francophone population of the dangers of Anglicization. Oh my gosh, to be Anglicized. You know, when you hear politicians saying we must make sure that young Francophones don't attend an English CETA because they've become Anglicized. You know, I think to become Anglicized, that sounds like, do you become a zombie-like? Suddenly you are not as human as you used to be. And the whole thing is to make people feel like you're in danger, and to make parents feel that you don't want to put your kids in danger, do you? What would happen if they became Anglicized? You know, they would come home and they wouldn't even speak French to you. Now, in all fairness to you know, our Aboriginal residents, they lived that. It did happen to them, yes. This is not happening to Francophones in our day and age the concept of Anglicization. I know with 35 years of experience in Champlain, a large percentage of the population French speaking. I would tell you that about 85% to 90% go on to a French university. And no one can recognize whether they're been anglicized or not. But what they do have is something that if you're going into business, science, technology, the English language is. It's the lingua franca. It is the Latin of modern day age, and it helps to know it, but you don't lose your identity. And I think this is the greatest danger I see now is in effect, I'm going to use this term, the propagandization of the situation of the French-speaking citizens of Quebec. Now, census comes out and says, oh, there are fewer French speakers. That's correct. Why are there fewer French speakers? Well, one of the main reasons is that families are not having 12 to 18 kids anymore. They're, in many instances, having one, sometimes two. So that what we're seeing then is that as the population grows older and mortality rates go up, birth rates go down, guess what? The English population is experiencing exactly the same thing. So we're all decreasing at pretty much the same rate. The English population probably a little bit faster because we're an older population. So that I will say it's an improper use of statistics. And what it does is it creates a sense that moving then from the message that you are at risk of being a French speaker. You know, I hear Mr. Legault in interviews saying, will we still be speaking French in Montreal? The first time I heard that, I nearly fell out of my seat. To think that that possibility is really, again, sending messaging to create a sense of fear. When you fear a group of people, English speakers, it then gets translated into day-to-day activities so that there is more chance that you will encounter as an English speaker if you're speaking English. Maybe this has happened to some people. I know it's happened to me. Talking with a friend in a parking lot in English, and someone comes up and says, "Hey, ici on parle français." It is as if just the use of English in a context that has nothing more to it than a private exchange can be, in fact, seen as something that needs to be eradicated, changed. And now we're even hearing about how we have to get people, primarily aimed at newcomers, have to use French in the home. Now, when the government feels that it's okay to enter your kitchen and tell you what language you can talk to your wife and kids in, or I'll turn it around. Because I would be the male person, and if you're the female person, if you're the kids. And you may have some grandparents around that have struggled with both languages. And so you talk to them, if you're one of the kids, in Italian or Greek or whatever is the language that they know, and you have three languages maybe. In most places, I think this would be seen as, hey, this is really good. This is remarkable. But what we're seeing now is that when you sow seeds of fear, it grows then actions that are characteristics of people who fear the other. The us and theming, we haven't had it this intense in a long time. we had just established that kind of equilibrium where people were able to live together, enjoy being together without that sense that you may be crossing a line. And so when you're interacting with people who display, it's a sense of, you can pick it up easily, whether they feel that you are a threat. You may be a big threat or you may be a small threat, is that you could be one of, let's say it's a bit like with the pandemic. We never were really sure who was infected or not, but we started to wear masks. We started to be vaccinated against the virus. And what I think is happening here is that there is an active element in the legislation that we're seeing to create that sense that better be careful. The people you may be encountering could be those who are bringing to you the virus of Anglicization. How horrible. And if it's constant, we have to look at the huge differences in the reporting of many things that are happening around language, comparing the English and the French media. There are some huge differences there. And I think this is something that, from the point of view of just interest, I like to look at it. From the point of view of impact, this is scary. And I think in terms of using that word scary, that doesn't mean go and hide. That means we have to step up more than ever. One of the things, I notice you are about to ask a question, so I'll let you ask.
No, Gerry, I don't want to interrupt, and you're on a great train of thought. We're just going to run out of time here.
Okay.
And so I'm going to ask you the next question, and a lot of these are very similar, and I'm going to ask it so you can continue your train of thought, but just so that we have a recording of this question being asked and you have an opportunity to respond. Well, what is the biggest problem facing Quebec? And in your mind, how do you feel it could be resolved?
I think the biggest threat to Quebec right now is that through this legislation, which is very repressive and in many ways violates the basic human rights, we will create a ghetto. And I think the ghettoization of Quebec is probably just as real as the sovereign, the possibility of becoming a sovereign Quebec. And I think that what we may well end up with is that sense that Quebec is a place where, you think twice before you invest. And maybe I could end it off by giving you something very personal. Our oldest son, who lives in Newfoundland, he's been there for 23 years. Last year, he said, we want to come to Quebec. I want to come home. The kids are ready. We as a family want to come to Quebec. My wife and I had to say to our son, I sent him a copy of Bill 96. I said, before we continue this conversation, read this bill. He read it and we had a conversation. And, kind of heartbreaking to think your son, think of it, in terms of personalizing it. That's what my wife and I had to do. We had to say, you read it? Do you still want to come home? The answer was no. And it's all because of repressive legislation and just not knowing how things are going to turn out.
Well, I'm going to steal something from Guy Rogers' playbook. It was very effective here with the next question. I want you to indicate by a show of fingers. This is a visual trick.
Okay.
Very, very effective, I found. I'm sure you did in Guy's documentary. And I want to announce that I am stealing from you, Guy. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being the strongest, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges?
Seven.
Thanks. Now, Gerry, I'm going to give you another opportunity here. Is there anything else, anything at all that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec?
Let me continue with the fingers, please. If you would ask me this 15, 20 years ago, that would have been my answer. And that what it is that the present situation in Quebec, I think, is one where instead of being able to focus on the kinds of things I've already talked about, working together, making Quebec the destination in North America, to come, to live, to invest, to be educated, that's a risk. And it is that risk of us turning into something that is more of a place to avoid, to leave, to not come to. That's tragic. That is one of the very, I think, real issues that I wrestle with. I've had to wrestle with it personally. I know so many friends have just said, enough's enough, bye. I have not said that. I've thought about it for a couple of times, and I'll say, I'm not running away from anything. I am here. I am well rooted. And if you want to uproot me, I am going to raise a challenge to any of you to just try.
Very good, Gerry. That was a very good interview, and I thank you so much for participating. I'm going to turn off the recording now. We can continue this conversation